Hey guys, and welcome to today's little short video on vocabulary. So if you've read the title right, yes, you guys did read it right. It's about how to memorize 80 words per week in vocab. So I know that's a really bold claim, and I hope I'll be able to actually deliver upon that. So one of the biggest questions that I get asked by parents is often, Stephen, how do I go about, encouraging my child or making them, memorize vocab, right? What are some tips? What are some strategies? How do I go about doing that? Because often what happens is parents complain about how their kids, once they learn a word, they often forget it, or they could learn two words and they remember one and they forget the other. And often what ends up happening is this kind of leaking tap situation whenever you try to memorize more and more words, you also leak many, many words, right? And so today what I want to do is I want to introduce some pretty profound techniques, these or techniques that I've used myself personally to help me through law school, as well as help, of course, all of my kids get through the OC and selective exams and develop them to a very, very high level of vocab. Because if you guys have seen any of the writing samples in the Facebook group, you would have a pretty good idea of the kind of standard of vocab that we expect. Now, there are many different ways to develop vocab. Obviously you can write sentences, you can include it in your writing. I'm not going to talk about that kind of method today. Today I'm going to focus on mnemonics, okay? So mnemonics are a very special type of memory tool, and they're especially useful for memorizing very large vocab lists, okay? And that's going to be the primary focus today. All of this is scientifically backed, right? So, there are memory grandmasters that I'll be quoting and alluding to throughout this. So all of this works. And if you, if you're unclear about any of that, then you can definitely ask me any questions at the very end, right? Anyway, I hope you guys enjoy this presentation, and let's jump right in. So I think first off, I'll talk about why vocab is important. So I think right now, obviously there are many of you who don't really understand the importance of vocab. You guys are like, oh yeah, vocab's whatever. It's not the most important thing. However, vocab is actually one of the most instrumental things when it comes to performing well in selective and OC, and I'll explain why. Because when you think about it, thinking skills is now highly English-based, reading comprehension is obviously English-based, and you have writing, right, in the selective. So, vocab is essentially important, is critically important to perform well in not only the reading comprehension section, but it's also critically important for the writing section as well. And I'll talk more about why vocab is the most important thing in writing in a little bit. But it's critical that you have really good vocab. Now, what I often see happening is that parents will go into a situation where they'll kind of memorize a couple of words here and there, and because it ends up becoming too difficult for them, they'll basically just stop, right? And they won't push the child further because it's obviously not working. Now, you guys, there's no shortage of vocab lists out there, right? Like there are so many vocab lists out there, it's not even funny. You guys go online, you can find, vocab lists for TOEFL, OC, selective, whatever. And so the issue is not really the vocab list. The issue is more the way that you go about memorizing that vocab, okay? Now, I can't say that all my kids routinely memorize 80 words a week, but I definitely say that the majority of the top kids that I teach memorize 80 words a week, and it shows profound results in terms of how they perform in our weekly trial tests. So kids with stronger vocab always do better than the kids with weaker vocab, okay? Obviously, there are other things involved, but it's almost like, if you want to be a rugby player, then you need to be strong, right? True, agility matters. True, there are other things like technique and whatnot, but the crux of it is you need to be strong, right? And that's what vocab is. It's kind of like that inner strength that you have and that potential that you have to be able to understand different things. So let's jump right into the technique that I'm going to show you guys today and why it's important. So like I said, most of you forget words as quickly as you remember. You develop kind of learned helplessness. You do not learn new words or minimal words, and you have a leaking tap. Now, today, the strategy I'm going to show you is something called mnemonics, and the easier way to understand this is just understanding the analogy of the anchor, okay? So, oftentimes what happens is when kids read or when kids try to memorize different words, they're basically just memorizing the word and the definition, okay? So that's most kids, right? Most kids will go out of their way and they'll basically just memorize the word and they'll memorize the definition, which is a terrible way to go about learning things, right? So they basically look at the word, look at the definition, look at the word, look at the definition, and they try to kind of hustle, that definition into their mind. The difference between that method and the method that I'm going to show you is that what we do with anchors is we basically we anchor new words to old words. So instead of learning a completely new word, what we do through the technique of mnemonics and through the techniques of anchoring is you basically, you're attaching a new piece of knowledge to an old piece of knowledge, which obviously makes it, number one, more memorable, and number two, right, it's not like you're learning something 100% new. So even like you would notice the best teachers in the world do this, right? They, when they teach, they try to teach through stories. They try to teach new concepts by relating to your past experiences. And that's exactly what anchoring is all about, right? Anchoring is about taking a new word, finding something in that word that reminds you of an old word, and through that process, you basically attach these new memories to old memories, and they just compound and they build upon each other, right? This has been the only technique, by the way, that I've come across in my, the last 7-8 years, right, that I've seen really stick with kids, and it really makes it memorable. So the problem with, the traditional method of just looking at the word and looking at the definition, looking at the word and look at the definition, it doesn't stick. You know what I mean? It's not memorable, right? There's nothing to attach it to, right? So, through the use of technique, through the use of mnemonics, what we can ensure is we can ensure that the words become memorable, and we can make sure that they stick. Now, you guys might be like, well, Stephen, where's the scientific, where's the science to back this? So there's a really good book by Joshua Foer, right? It's called Moonwalking with Einstein, and he basically extrapolates, the whole notion of memory, right? He talks about how, memory grandmasters, people who are able to memorize, entire decks of cards, how they go about doing it. And the way that they go about memorizing these things is in a very imaginative way. He talks a lot about mnemonics and the importance of mnemonics. But, let's say, for example, if you're trying to memorize something really difficult, like, for example, some of these guys try to memorize, entire pack of cards, like 52 cards, the order of those cards in a minute. You know what I mean? It's ridiculous, right? So the only way that you're going to memorize that is not by 1, 2, 4, Jack, Queen, whatever. The only way that you can go about memorizing that is by painting kind of almost like a picture, and again, attaching it to something a little bit more imaginative and a little bit more memorable. So one thing that I want to say, and this is something that I stress a lot in my classes, is choose anchors which are memorable. Now, let me show you guys how to actually do this. And I'm going to give you guys some really nice tools that'll be extremely beneficial for your kids. And so, obviously, if you're watching this video right now, great. If you're watching this later, again, make sure that you let your kids watch this video as well, okay? So you need to make the vocab memorable. If the vocab is not memorable, then they're not going to remember it, okay? I think that's simple enough, and yet so many people, I'd say 99% of kids have no idea what they're doing. So let's just go to a vocab list that I've assigned on my website. So this came out in the Facebook group just recently, and this is just like probably 1% of, what we go through in vocab, every single time at Scholarly, but nonetheless, let's just go through it right now. So we have the word nonchalant, okay? And nonchalant just means when someone is, overly casual, indifferent, they don't really care about a certain situation very much. That's when they're nonchalant. Now, the first thing that I would ask my kids to do is try to find a word within nonchalant, right? Or try to find almost like a snippet of a word within nonchalant that reminds you of another word. Now, the first word that I think of is challenge, okay? So I see the word C-H-A-L, and I think of challenge, right? And so I think of, and then I put in the prefix, which is non, and I think, well, someone who's nonchalant, someone who's indifferent or casual or unconcerned is not going to be too fussed by a challenge, right? So in other words, you just memorize those two words, not challenge or no challenge. Does that make sense? Now, you guys might be like, well, Stephen, how did you figure that out? So sometimes, most of the time, I figure this out by myself. And I understand, a lot of parents can be like, well, Stephen, how do you find these anchors? Where do you go about finding these anchors? And again, it's just use Google. So there's a really good website called Mnemonics, mnemonicdictionary.com, right? Which is about nonchalant. And so you can type in whatever word you want here. And it says right here, nonchalant, it gives you the definition. It's just saying, when you're unconcerned, it gives you a whole bunch of sentences. But more importantly, it actually gives you some memory aids, some mnemonics. So nonchalant seems similar like non-challenge. If there is no challenge, life is calm and relaxed and carefree. There we go. Okay, and you can apply this formula for the rest of it. Okay, so then we have something like nostalgia. Okay, so we'll go through this word as well, and I'll show you guys the same technique. So you write down the word nostalgia. Nostalgia just means longing for the past, like longing for something in the past. Okay, so when you're nostalgic, you're generally wanting something that you might have had in the past, right? So maybe you're nostalgic for your childhood, when you're running through the fields, or when you were running through the parks, or when you're running through something, right? Now, my word of advice to parents is that you should always encourage your kids to make their own anchors. Ask them to make their own anchors, right? And there's a skill in making anchors as well. But more importantly, make these anchors and make them memorable. So the weirder and the wackier they become, the actual, actually becomes more memorable. So I remember as a kid, I used to come up with the weirdest kind of anchors, but I would just remember the words because, they were just so memorable. So likewise, in this case, nostalgic, I think of nostrils, right? So I think of, when someone's nostalgic, oftentimes they're crying, and so sometimes their nostrils will start flaring up, right? So that's the way that I think about that. Now, again, you can type in the word nostalgic here, and everyone's different, right? So some people are going to have different versions of nostalgic to other people. Now, their example that they have here is tragic, right? That, obviously something nostalgic, is rather sad, rather saddening, and that's exactly like what something tragic is, all right? So when something tragic happens, it's really bad, makes you really, really upset. Now, the only issue with using a word like that, using like tragic or using one of these mnemonic dictionaries, is that sometimes you'll have words that the kids don't know. Okay, so always try to kind of encourage them to find as many anchors as they can within this word, right? The other word that I see in nostalgia is stale, right? So generally when something is stale, it's old, right? It's from the past, right? So, you can write down the word stale and you think, okay, well, I'm nostalgic, I'm longing for, bread of the past, right? Or I'm longing for, my grandfather clock from the past, and it might be really, really stale. I'm longing to be in my grandmother's kind of room, right? And, there might have been a lot of really stale air there. Okay, so again, stale means old, nostalgic kind of means longing for something that's old, right? Something from the past. And you would just continue to go through these kind of things, okay? And this is kind of like the first step. And every single day, every single week, you don't need to do too much, right? So you don't need to go too crazy with this. All you really need is you need to memorize, like, I would say to be proficient, and if you're just starting out, you need to memorize at least 70 words a week, okay? That's like bare minimum, if you want to do like well. And again, it just depends on where you're starting from. So if your kid's been reading books and, they've been developing their vocab their whole life, right? And been reading like difficult books, then they'll be fine. But if your kid's just starting out, they've had no experience whatsoever, and, you want them to excel in OC and selective, and later on, let's say you want to do scholarship exams, they need an incredible vocabulary. And it's developed through a multitude of things. Like often parents ask me, what do I do? Do I read books? Do I do this? Do I do that? Do I do whatever? And I tell them, look, the best way to do something is just to go directly and do it, right? Like some parents talk about, and I'm going to go on a bit of a tangent, some people think that playing musical instruments makes you intelligent. Well, wouldn't it be better if you just read books and did maths? Like that would make you a lot smarter in that regard than playing music, right? So, Don't go through things in an indirect fashion. Again, reading books will indirectly benefit your vocab, okay? It does benefit vocab for kids who are very curious and very intuitive. But for the majority of kids, what should they do? They should memorize vocab lists, right? Because that's the most direct and tangible way of increasing their vocab. Instead of going through some alleyway and some indirect way and doing this and that, making them read the news, like reading the news and reading books and doing all that kind of stuff is glorious, it's great. But it doesn't stop the fact that you still need to memorize these words. And why not go directly? You know what I mean? It's like playing basketball will make you, jump high, or playing basketball is gonna, help you become more athletic. Well, what about if you just did athletics drills? What about if you just jumped every single day for 100 times, right? It'd be a lot more beneficial. So make sure that when you're going to do things in more of a direct manner. From my experience, if you take a relatively untrained kid and you want to get them into a top 10 OC, or you want to get them into a top 10 selective, or even scholarship, they need these performance enhancers, you know what I mean? So when I talk about vocab is almost like that performance enhancer, and the only way that they're going to develop it is if they get these words and they use them directly. The other thing that I want to say is that, a lot of parents, have seen, some of the writing pieces that I've given out. All of our kids have very, very strong writing at Scholarly, and the main reason behind that is we use vocab, right? We use really difficult vocab words. Sometimes we've gotten complaints that, this year 5 kid sounds like they're in year 10 or year 11 and year 12, and people get really, really mad about it. Again, like sometimes, true, our kids might misuse words, but we obviously use the process of structuring sentences to correct that. But more importantly, the only way that you're going to be able to differentiate your writing piece from everybody else is through the use of vocab. Okay? It's not through the use of like anything else, right? It's through the use of vocab. Even if you're going to use figure of language, metaphors, similes, whatever, you still need strong vocab. You can't be writing, he ran as fast as a cheetah, right? That's not a juicy sentence. And so that's one thing that parents really need to realize. So it's important in your writing, it's important in thinking skills. A lot of thinking skills are becoming increasingly, comprehension based. They're almost similar to the main idea questions now. So if you don't understand the passage, then you're not going to be able to do well. The last thing that I want to say is find the time. You know what I mean? This is why I say time is so important. You need to find the time, because if you're just doing vocab, 2 times a week or 1 time a week, you shouldn't be doing that anyway, right? I'll put a graph later on in the group and through email. But basically, if you're not spending, if it's not a daily thing, it's not going to work, right? Because vocab, if you memorize a new word and then you stop memorizing new words, what will happen is you'll kind of forget things very, very quickly. And so you need that daily inbuilt routine to make sure that you get it, right? If not, then you'll basically, not remember anything, and you might as well just not do it. So what I would highly suggest is at least 30 minutes every single day, bare minimum, right? So 15 minutes right before you go to, 15 minutes when you wake up, 15 minutes when you go right before you go to sleep. That's generally the best time to memorize things. And then the other thing that I want to say is, if you're really, really good, then you'll spend about an hour a day memorizing vocab. Okay? So that's my opinion. Again, reading books is great, but reading books is more of a long-term strategy. You know what I mean? If you're looking to do something like OSINT, you got like a year, you don't really have that much time to read books. You know what I mean? Of course, still reading is extremely important, but if you want to develop vocab for these standardized tests, you kind of need to do that in a more direct, targeted fashion. Okay? Thanks. If you have any questions, please let me know. That's it from me today. Thanks, guys, and I'll see you guys all very soon. Bye.